You guys can see that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, stop me at any time. Okay? The respiratory system. It's a lot easier than the heart. Okay? But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to stop me. All right? What we're going to talk about is the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. We're going to talk about lungs, and we're going to talk about exchanging of gas, the definitions between inhalation and exhalation. And we're also going to explain how the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, are transported in the blood by the cardiovascular system. All right, some definitions. Respiration is the exchange of gases between the outside world, the blood, and the tissue and cells. It is a combination of three processes. It requires ventilation, which is breathing. It requires external respiration, otherwise known as pulmonary respiration, and that occurs in the lungs. It also requires tissue respiration, which is known as internal respiration, and that involves the cells and tissues of your body. And we rely on the cardiovascular system to transport the gases that are generated by the respiratory system. Okay? The structures of the respiratory system. The respiratory system is divided into two parts, the upper and lower respiratory system. Functionally, it has two components. Actually, it has three components, okay? But I really want you to know two, and I'll talk about the third. The two zones that I want you to know functionally are the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The conducting zone is the area in the respiratory system in which the gases exist. The respiratory zone is the area in the respiratory system where the gases are exchanged. So in the conducting zone, there is no exchange of gases. In the respiratory zone, the gases are exchanged. Oxygen and carbon dioxide and other gases are exchanged. There is also a third zone, and that third zone is the dead zone. The dead zone is the area of the respiratory system in which the gas never leaves. Okay? So there's a conducting zone, a respiratory zone, and a dead zone. This is an interesting photo. You think your lungs actually look like this? Look how dark they are.
No.
What do you think this is the lung of?
Smoker.
A smoker, yes. This is a smoker. Your lungs should be pink, like this, okay? Should be pink like this, all right? But here are some of the structures that you should be aware of, and we're going to talk about them. You know, here is the trachea. Over here is the trachea, and the trachea divides into the right and left main bronchus. And at the division is right here. It's got a name, and that name is the carina, C-A-R-I-N-A. It is a very sensitive area. If you have a foreign body that hits this area, you will start coughing. So it is the cough center of your trachea as it divides into right and left bronchus. And of course, we can't forget the upper airway. Here's the upper airway, and we'll talk a lot about the upper airway. There's not much I want you to know about the upper airway. But the upper airway consists of the nose, the pharynx, and the structures that are in those areas. The lower airway begins at the larynx, which is your voice box, and includes the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. Okay? So basically, this is the nose and pharynx and larynx. This is the upper airway. The upper airway. All right? The lower airway begins at the voice box, which is the larynx. And you can kind of see the structures that are in it. The structures that are in it. One of the most important structures that are in the upper airway is the epiglottis. Does anyone know the function of the epiglottis? I take that as a no. Okay? The epiglottis is a fold of tissue that when you are eating, it closes over the trachea so that you don't get any food or water into your lungs. It's a very important structure. A very important structure.
What is it called again?
Epiglottis. Here it is. Right here. Epiglottis. Okay. Can you see my cursor?
I didn't before, but now I see it, yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Okay. All right. Okay. The upper airway. I don't care if you know about the nose. It's not important. The nose is only important if you're going to be an ENT doctor. It's really not that important. I'm not going to ask you any questions on the nose. They beat this to death. There's no reason to worry about the nose. That's not important. It just isn't important. I'm not going to ask you any questions on the nose. Okay? You don't have to know the parts of the nose. Not important. But you do have to know the pharynx. The pharynx functions as a passageway for air and also food. It provides a resonating chamber for speech, and it houses the tonsils. And the tonsils, as we talked about in the lymphatic system, is important as an right, I can't even say it, an immunological reaction against foreign antigens. Okay? And there are regions of the pharynx. There's the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The larynx. The larynx is your voice box. It is a passageway from the pharynx into the trachea. And over the larynx is the epiglottis. Here it is, the epiglottis. This is tissue that protects the trachea from water and food while you're eating. There are many parts to the larynx that you need to know, especially the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage is your Adam's apple. It protects your trachea. Okay? Very important structure. The thyroid cartilage, otherwise known as your Adam's apple. There is also another cartilage in this area, and it is called the cricoid cartilage. Right here, cricoid cartilage. I want you to also notice that this is the thyroid gland. Okay? The cricoid cartilage is extremely important, And the reason it's extremely important is, what is the most important function of your body when you are injured? Okay? Is it your heart or is it your breathing?
Breathing.
Breathing.
Yes, breathing. Breathing is extremely important. If you don't breathe, your heart could be beating for days and you'll be dead. Okay? So it's important to breathe. And remember, we showed you the upper airway consisting of the nose, the mouth, and the pharynx. And now we're going to start going into the lower airway. Let me ask you a question. If you stop breathing, or if you have a patient that stops breathing, how do you breathe for that patient?
Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation.
Okay, number one's mouth to mouth, right? Number one's mouth to mouth. Okay, now I want to put you and that patient in an emergency department. And now you have all the tools to help that person breathe. So, how am I going to help that person breathe?
Don't you try to create like an airway by like puncturing something? Like you stick something. I forget where.
Well, I'm getting to that. Very, very good. I'm getting to that.
Is it a tracheotomy?
I'll say it again.
Is it a tracheotomy?
Yeah, it is a tracheotomy, but that's not the first thing we do. What's the first thing we do in someone who has stopped breathing? How do we breathe for them besides giving them mouth to mouth?
Would it be a ventilator?
Yes, we put them on a ventilator. And before we put them on a ventilator, we have to stick an endotracheal tube into their trachea, correct?
Correct.
How do we do that?
You have to intubate the patient.
Tell me how to do that. How do you do that?
You have to stick a tube down their throat.
Good. You have to stick a tube down their throat, through the vocal cords, into their trachea, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now you have a patient who took a shotgun to his mouth and blew his face off. Now he has no face. Now he has no upper airway. How do I breathe for this patient? Who said tracheotomy before?
I did. Mary Kate.
Good. Mary Kay, exactly. So this is why the cricoid cartilage is important, because what I would do is I would take a knife and I'd cut vertically, I'd spread it apart, and I'd puncture the trachea, because the trachea is right underneath here. Here's the trachea, right underneath here. And I would put an endotracheal tube into the cricoid cartilage. This is called a cricothyrotomy. A cricothyrotomy. Why would I not cut this way? Why would I not cut laterally or sagittally? Why wouldn't I cut this way? I would cut vertically, not sagittally.
Each
Why?
side of their voice
The
box.
thyroid gland?
Say it again.
Then you would cut the thyroid gland?
Yes, that's exactly why. You would cut the thyroid gland. So I'm going to do a vertical cut. I'm going to take some forceps and spread it apart, puncture the trachea, and put an ET tube in, a cricothyroidotomy, and I would save their life. I won't give them a new face, but I'll save their life. All right, everybody understand that? So
Yep.
I want you to know the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple, and the cricoid cartilage, where I would do a life-saving cricothyrotomy. All right? And here it is. Here's the thyroid cartilage. Here's the cricoid cartilage right here. Right here. Here it is. All right. I cut right through that ligament, right through it. Okay. All right. When I intubate someone with an endotracheal tube through their throat, I put a laryngoscope in the back of their pharynx and I look for the vocal cords. Here are the vocal cords. I know that if I put a tube in between the vocal cords, it only has one place to go. It goes into their trachea. And now I know I'm in their trachea, and now I know I can hook them up to a ventilator and breathe for them. So I look for this when I intubate someone. And I probably intubated about 5,000 individuals in my lifetime. And it's not as easy as it looks. It's not as easy as it looks, okay? But there it is. This is what I look for right here, right here, all right? Very important. Once we get past the larynx, we are now in the trachea. And the trachea extends from the larynx to the primary bronchi. That's where the bronchi split off into right and left main bronchi. And in the center of the split is the carina, which I told you is a very sensitive area in which has the cough reflex in it. Here it is. Here is the carina. Now you see it spelled for you, carina. Here it is. Okay, so we go through the larynx, through the trachea, into the carina, to the right main bronchus and the left main bronchus. All right, very important to understand. Okay. I also want you to look at this slide because it shows you that the right lung and the left lung are not equal. The right lung has 3 lobes: the right upper lobe, the right middle lobe, and the right lower lobe. The left lung only has 2 lobes. It has a left upper lobe and a left lower lobe. So the lungs are not equal. They're not equal. They're equal in size, but not in lobes. The right has 3, the left has 2. Once we go from the trachea to the main bronchi, which there are 2 of them, then the lobes have bronchi. Each lobe has a bronchus. So the right side has 3, the left side has 2. Then we go from the lobar bronchi to the segmental bronchi. Then we go into smaller bronchi called bronchioles. And then we go into the terminal bronchi. Okay? The reason this is important is because the terminal bronchioles are the end of the conducting zone. So far, we have air in the lungs, which is not being used. It's just there. It's just there. Once we pass the terminal bronchioles, then we will be into a different zone. Okay, a different zone. All right. So here it is. The conducting zone is just air exchange. It's just air. The trachea, the main bronchi, the lobar and segmental bronchi, the bronchioles, and the terminal bronchioles. But Once we pass the terminal bronchioles, we get into the respiratory zone. This is where air is now exchanged. Oxygen goes in, carbon dioxide comes out. The respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveolar sacs. This is where gas is exchanged in the respiratory zone. Here it is again, okay? The picture. Here's the carina. Here's the right upper lobe, the right middle lobe, the right lower lobe. Here is the left upper lobe and the left lower lobe. All right? Someone tell me the main muscle of respiration. You learned nothing in AP1, huh? What's the main muscle of respiration?
Is it the diaphragm?
It is. That is the diaphragm. And here it is, right here, the diaphragm. The main muscle of respiration. All right? All right. Each lung is enclosed and protected by a serous membrane. This serous membrane is called the pleural membrane. You will learn next week about disease and trauma that interrupts that membrane. Okay? And those are called pneumothoraces. And there's going to be one student who will talk to you about, a group who will talk to you about pneumothoraces. All right? All serous membranes, as you learned in AP1, have two layers, a visceral layer and a parietal layer. The visceral pleura is on top of the lung. Here it is. It protects the lung. The parietal pleura protects the cavity. So all serous membranes have a visceral layer, which is on the organ. In this case, it's on the lungs, and a parietal layer, which covers the cavity, and in this case, covers the pleural cavity. Okay? This is a bizarre slide, but it just shows you that there's a pleural cavity. All right, a pleural cavity. Here it is. Here's the difference between the right and left lungs. Look. 3 lobes to the right, 2 lobes to the left. All right? Don't worry about fissures. That's not important. Just know the lungs are not equal. Okay? Let's talk about gas exchange. The conducting zone ends at the terminal bronchioles. The respiratory zone then begins. It begins at the respiratory bronchioles and terminates in the alveoli. Terminates in the alveoli. This is where gas is exchanged. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out in the lungs. All right? This is the respiratory zone, from the respiratory bronchioles through the alveolar ducts, through the alveolar sacs to the alveoli. The alveoli are sac-like structures to accept air. They accept the oxygen and they get rid of carbon dioxide. They are attached to the capillaries. Inside of these alveoli are 2 types of cells. two types of alveolar cells. Type 1 alveolar cell is used in gas exchange. It functions to absorb oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. Type 2 alveolar cells do not function in gas exchange. They function in the production of a protein called surfactant. And that surfactant allows the lungs to have elasticity. Elasticity. It allows the lungs to enlarge and it allows the lungs to collapse, but not fully collapse.
What protein do they make?
They make surfactant, 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 surfactant.
Thank you.
Okay. It's down here, actually. If you look down here, here it is, surfactant, all right? The one thing that's important about surfactant is that it allows the lung never to collapse fully. It is destroyed by pollution. The number one pollution in the world happens to be cigarette smoke. So cigarette smoke destroys type 2 cells, which produce surfactant. And the lungs become useless. They can no longer expand. They can no longer collapse. And is a major problem in diseases caused by smoking and pollution. And you're going to have a lecture on pollution effects on the lung. Blood supply to the lungs. Oxygen is supplied to the lungs through the bronchial arteries. The bronchial arteries supply oxygen to the lungs. Remember, the pulmonary arteries carry venous blood. So the lungs get their oxygen from the bronchial arteries. Okay? The blood exits the lungs through the pulmonary veins and the bronchial veins. Where do the pulmonary veins eventually go into? What do these pulmonary veins empty into? That would be a good question on exam number 2. Does anybody know what say it again?
Is it back to the heart?
Yes, back to the heart. What part of the heart?
Is it the atrium?
Which one?
The left atrium.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. All right? The important thing here is that the oxygenation of the lungs comes from the bronchial arteries. Comes from the bronchial arteries. Okay? The lungs are very different from the cardiovascular system. If there is an area of the lungs that is blocked by tumor or by pneumonia or by obstruction, the lungs recognize that, send a message to the brain, and says to the brain, there's an area of my lung that is blocked off with pneumonia, do not give that area any oxygen. Divert the blood flow away from that area. So when you have an area of pneumonia, the lungs refuses to allow oxygen to enter that part of the lung by the bloodstream of the lungs. So in response to hypoxia, it diverts the blood away from poorly ventilated areas to areas that are well ventilated. That is why when you listen to someone's lungs that has pneumonia or obstruction, you hear problems in air exchange. You hear crackles. You hear wheezes because the lungs has decided not to give that area any oxygen. Now, I've simplified this, but does that make any sense to you guys?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. This is just a refresher of the upper and lower airways. I wouldn't worry about any of the cilia or goblet cells, not important really. Okay. And then you get into the main bronchi and then the respiratory zone itself. All right. I'm not going to ask you any tissue questions or cell questions because basically that is AP1. But I will point out to you that the respiratory zone is basically made up of simple squamous epithelium. And that epithelium is what is important in gas exchange. Whenever you see simple squamous, it means that there is diffusion of gases through a one-layer system. Simple squamous, as you know from AP1, is one layer of flat cells. And when you see one layer of flat cells, it is usually because of gas exchange and diffusion. All right? Very important. Very important. Okay, let's talk about respiration, otherwise known as breathing. It has to do with atmospheric pressures. The normal atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. At rest, the diaphragm is relaxed and the alveolar pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure, and there is no airflow. When you inhale, the diaphragm contracts. The accessory muscles, otherwise known as the external intercostal muscles of your chest, contract. The chest cavity gets bigger. When the chest cavity gets bigger, the volume increases. When the volume increases, the pressure drops. So now the alveolar pressure inside your lungs is lower than the atmospheric pressure. Here are the numbers. It's lower than 760. Lower than 760. When that happens, air flows into the lungs because of the pressure gradient. The lung volume expands. During a deep inhalation, the chest muscles expand, thereby creating a further drop in alveolar pressure. This is known as Boyle's law. When the volume of the chest increases, the pressure drops. V over P. V over P. Okay? That's inhalation. When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes. The external muscles of respiration relax. The chest and lungs recoil. The chest cavity contracts. The volume decreases. If the formula is V over P, when the volume decreases, the pressure must increase. When the pressure increases, air flows out of the lungs. Any questions on inhalation and expiration? It's Boyle's law. V over P. Volume over pressure. When the volume increases, the pressure must decrease. When the pressure increases, the volume must decrease. V over P, Boyle's law. Okay? This is pulmonary ventilation. Air flows between the atmosphere and the alveoli of the lung. Because of the differences in pressure created by the contraction and relaxation of the respiratory muscles. When you inhale, the diaphragm contracts, allowing air into the alveoli. The pressure in the alveoli decreases because the volume of air in the lungs increases. When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes. The volume of air inside the chest is decreased. Therefore, the pressure is increased. That is pulmonary ventilation. And here it is, Boyle's law. The volume of gas varies inversely with its pressure, V over P. Boyle's law. One of the first gas laws. There are three of them that I want you to remember. But the most important is Boyle's. V over P. There are many muscles of respiration. As we said before, the number one and the main muscle of respiration is your diaphragm. Here it is. And there are others. The others are the additional accessory muscles of respirations, and they're basically the muscles of your chest wall. The intercostals, the scalenes, the sternocleidomastoid, the internal intercostals, and the obliques. These are your abdominal muscles, These are your abdominal muscles. When you exhale, you use your abdominal muscles to get air out of your lungs. And these are all the abdominal muscles. The external oblique, the internal oblique, the transverse abdominis, and the rectus abdominis. When you inhale, you only use the muscles of respiration in your chest, not in your abdomen. All right? Very important. When you inhale, the diaphragm contracts. When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes. This is a repeat of what we just said. So you should certainly know the pressure changes in pulmonary ventilation. All right? There are a lot of factors that affect pulmonary ventilation. Surface tension. Surface tension is the direct force on the alveoli, which must be overcome to expand the lungs during inspiration. This is why you have the protein surfactant produced by alveolar type 2 cells. This will lower the surface tension, allowing the alveoli to expand during inspiration. And when you exhale, the alveoli will not collapse because of surface tension produced by the alveolar cells number 2 surfactant. You have to have recoil. You have to be able to decrease the size of the alveoli during expiration. And this is also where surfactant comes in. And you also must have compliance. The higher the compliance, the easier it is for your lungs and your chest wall to be expanded. Anything that affects your chest wall or your lungs will decrease compliance. You want high compliance. If I shot you in your chest, I would decrease your compliance. If I took a baseball bat and struck you in your ribs, you would have decreased compliance. If you have pneumonia in your lungs, you can't expand your lungs and you will have decreased compliance. So compliance needs to be high for you to be able to inhale and exhale. Anything that disrupts inhalation or exhalation will decrease your compliance. Some of the words here that we use and don't use. We don't use this word. This word means normal respiration. We don't ever use this word. We just say you're breathing okay. What do you think apnea means?
Isn't that snoring?
No, that's not snoring. Whenever you see an A in front of the word, in front of a word in biology, it means it's not happening. So if nypnea means breathing and you have an A in front of it, it means you stop breathing. Okay? You stop breathing. This is a person who's not breathing. He's apneic. What do you think dyspnea means? What if I told you if you see DYS in front of a word, it means difficulty. Difficulty breathing. So this is difficulty breathing. Okay? What is go ahead, go.
Does apnea only can that happen just like right now, or does it have to happen like if I'm sleeping already? Because can a person just be breathing, and then just automatically just stop breathing out of nowhere? Or is it it usually has to happen? Oh wow.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you can just go boom, stop breathing. Yeah. I can easily do that to you.
Yeah.
I can put you in a room with cyanide and say, take a deep breath.
Yeah, and
before you're able to exhale, you quit breathing. Okay?
Yeah. Okay.
If I remove the oxygen from the room, you will stop breathing. That's called apnea. Dyspnea, on the other hand, is difficulty breathing. Difficulty breathing. People with pneumonia have difficulty breathing. Okay? What do you think tachypnea means? What does tachy mean?
Like fast. So
fast
breathing.
Fast, exactly. Fast breathing. Okay? What causes fast breathing?
Exercise.
Say it again.
Exercise is a good answer.
Yeah, exercise, sure. What if I put a snake on your table?
It's over. I'm out.
Yeah, exactly. You have fast breathing. Okay. Exactly. Okay. Costal breathing. Costal breathing means that only your external muscles of respiration are breathing for you. That means your diaphragm has been injured. Diaphragmatic breathing means your chest is not moving. Only your abdomen is moving. Only your diaphragm is moving. And that happens with cervical neck injuries and spinal cord injuries. We know that the diaphragm is controlled by C5. There's a nerve that comes out of the cervical plexus at C5, and that C5 nerve is the phrenic nerve, and the phrenic nerve controls breathing. And the old thing in medicine is C5 keeps you alive, because if you have a fracture of your neck above C5, it will affect the spinal cord and you will no longer be able to breathe. So that's important, okay? C5 keeps you alive. The phrenic nerve stimulates the diaphragm to breathe. There are a lot of abnormal breathing movements. I am not going to ask you any of them. You don't really need to know these. These are not important. These are not important. I will talk to you about lung volumes and capacities in another lecture. I don't like the way they present it. It's not presented meaningfully. This slide to me is meaningless. It doesn't explain anything, and I will explain it to you in better detail right after this lecture and another lecture. We talked about Boyle's law. Boyle's law is volume over pressure. When the volume decreases, the pressure must increase. When the pressure increases, the volume must decrease. There are two other laws. Dalton's law says that each gas in a mixture of gases exerts its own pressure as if no other gases were present. So tell me the gases in air. What are the major three gases that are in air? Does anybody know?
It's in nitrate, oxygen, and hydrogen.
You got two of them. Nitrogen, oxygen, what's the third gas? Anybody?
Helium?
No.
Is it carbon?
Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide. The majority of air is nitrogen. 21% of the air you breathe is oxygen. A very small amount of the air you breathe is carbon dioxide. And the other particulates in air is water. Okay? So those are the three major gases. Nitrogen, which is like 76%, oxygen, which is 21%, and carbon dioxide, which is less than 1%. Those are the three gases, okay? The most important, other than Boyle's law, is Henry's law. Henry's law states the quantity of a gas that will dissolve in a liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of that gas when the temperature remains constant. Have any of you ever been to a doctor and they put a pulse oximeter on your finger?
Yes.
Okay, and what does the number usually say? What does that number say? Do you remember what that number was?
No.
It's usually from like 96 to 99, right?
Yeah, or to 100, from 96 to 100. All right. Does anyone know what that means? What does that mean?
Is that your oxygen level?
It's not really your oxygen level because oxygen levels are considered to be partial pressures. This is what it is. It is the percentage of hemoglobin that is saturated with oxygen. What is the main carrier of oxygen in your body? You
Blood.
learn that in the blood system. How is oxygen carried in your body? On what? You guys forgot already?
Red blood cells.
And what part of the red blood cell?
The hemoglobin.
Thank you. So hemoglobin carries the
IgA.
oxygen. Okay? It's attached to the iron part of hemoglobin. Okay? And basically, a pulse oximeter measures the percent of the saturation of your hemoglobin with oxygen. So between 96 and 100% is what your hemoglobin should be. Now let's talk about Henry's Law. Here's a typical example of Henry's Law. What percent of the air you breathe has oxygen in it? Oxygen is what percent of the air you breathe? I have all day.
It's like 30%.
Say it again.
I said 21. I think somebody else said something else though.
It is 21. 21% of the air you breathe is oxygen. Okay? Now, let's say you develop pneumonia, a severe pneumonia. You come to the hospital in a car. The nurse at the triage desk takes your vital signs, and one of those vital signs is a pulse oximeter. She puts a pulse oximeter on your finger and it says 62%. How does she raise the amount of hemoglobin that is saturated with oxygen? What is she going to do to raise that number from 62% up to normal? What is that nurse going to do?
Give you oxygen.
Thank you. She's going to give you oxygen. So now you're breathing 100% oxygen. That's Henry's Law. The quantity of gas that will dissolve in a liquid is proportional to the partial pressure of that gas when the temperature remains constant. All she has to do is change your atmosphere. Your atmosphere now is breathing 100% oxygen. That's Henry's Law. Any questions on that? All right, let's continue. Let's now talk about external and internal respiration. External respiration is when oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. This is now at the alveolar level. This is when you're getting oxygen into the bloodstream and carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream. When that blood goes to the tissues in your legs during internal respiration, oxygen goes into the capillaries and carbon dioxide comes out. Okay? So that is very important to understand. You know how oxygen is transported. We just talked about it. It's transported on hemoglobin. Here it is. 98.5% of oxygen is transported on hemoglobin. But how is carbon dioxide transported? Carbon dioxide is transported basically as bicarbonate. 70% of the carbon dioxide that is transported in your body is in the form of bicarbonate. Bicarbonate. Okay? That is extremely important. That is how carbon dioxide is transported, as bicarbonate ions. All right? Very important. What affects your hemoglobin to accept and keep oxygen? The partial pressure of oxygen. Again, the partial pressure of oxygen. 21% of all air is oxygen. Okay? So if your oxygen level drops, you need to have more oxygen pumped in. pH. We will talk about pH in greater detail when we talk about acid-base balance. But if you have acidosis, if your pH drops below 7.35, your tissues need oxygen, and hemoglobin will hold on and give your tissues more oxygen if your pH drops below 7.35. What if your temperature is 104? Your tissues need oxygen. Your tissues need oxygen. And if your temperature is 104, hemoglobin will get rid of oxygen and put it into your tissues. BPG is a thing I don't really care if you know about. But what about the types of hemoglobin? How many types of hemoglobin are there? What's the normal hemoglobin? What type is it? Does anyone know? Who did the lecture on sickle cell anemia? What type of hemoglobin do sickle cell anemia patients have?
Like low iron or?
No, what type? There's a type. There's a type. What if I told you that the normal hemoglobin is known as A, hemoglobin A? Everybody has hemoglobin A that's normal. But in sickle cell disease, what type of hemoglobin do they have? It's not A. What is it? Who did the sickle cell lecture? Who did the sickle cell PowerPoint?
I'm not sure who did the PowerPoint, but I think it's hemoglobin S.
You are correct. It's hemoglobin S. Hemoglobin S. Okay? So hemoglobin S has a low affinity for oxygen. Hemoglobin A has a stronger affinity for oxygen. okay? Has a stronger affinity for oxygen. All right? Here is the partial pressure of oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen. When it is high, the saturation of hemoglobin is high. Here it is high. So if I give everybody 100% oxygen, the saturation of their hemoglobin will be high. That's how it affects the affinity for oxygen. What about pH? What about pH? If your pH is, here's normal. 7.4 is the normal pH. When you're acidotic and you have a lower pH, here is a pH of 7.2, you will lose oxygen because the tissue needs oxygen. So hemoglobin will give it to the tissues, and then hemoglobin will be lower in oxygen. If you have alkalosis, which is the high pH of 7.6, your tissues don't need any more oxygen, and hemoglobin will hold on to oxygen. Okay? Also, what is the effect of carbon dioxide? The effect of carbon dioxide. You will learn in the acid base that when you have a high blood partial pressure of carbon dioxide, you are severely acidotic. And when you are severely acidotic, the tissue needs oxygen. So hemoglobin will unload its oxygen to the tissues. And the reverse is true when you have low blood carbon dioxide. Low blood carbon dioxide. Okay? And what about temperature? What about temperature? If you have a temperature of 110, your tissues need oxygen. You will have a lower amount of hemoglobin holding on to oxygen. When your temperature is cold, you will have a higher amount of oxygen onto hemoglobin. So that's how these things affect the affinity for hemoglobin and oxygen. Here is a very important slide. The maternal hemoglobin is hemoglobin A. Fetal hemoglobin is hemoglobin F. Remember, the fetus lungs don't work. So fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than the maternal hemoglobin. This hemoglobin, known as hemoglobin F, has a higher affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin A. Okay? Here's the formula that I want you to know. I think I've talked about this before. Here's the formula right here. Carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of carbonic anhydrase will give you carbonic acid. This is one of the buffering systems of your body. To break down carbonic acid into bicarbonate and hydrogen, you also need carbonic anhydrase. And this is all done in the red blood cell. This is all done in the red blood cell. This is internal respiration. This is internal respiration. It occurs in the bloodstream. It occurs in external respiration and internal respiration. And it is all due to this enzyme. Know this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, converts CO2 plus water into carbonic acid and breaks down carbonic acid into CO2 and water. You know from the cardiovascular system that the brain has an involuntary center in the medulla. Well, for the respiratory system, there are two areas that are involuntary that control respiration. One of them is in the medulla, and the other is in the pons. There are pontine respiratory groups that are in the pons that control respiration. There are dorsal and ventral respiratory groups in the medulla that also control respiration. So respiration is basically controlled in the pons and in the medulla. There are two areas of the brain that control respiration. Okay? You don't have to know what they actually control. Just know that the difference is that in the respiratory system, there are two areas, and in the cardiovascular system, there's only one area. All right? And of course, there are other influences to respiration. Okay? If you are seeing a car accident, if you're seeing a snake, if you're inhaling noxious gases, you will change the way you breathe just by seeing things, and that's the cortical influence. This is from your cerebrum. There are also chemoreceptors that control respiration, and these chemoreceptors monitor the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and they provide input into your respiratory center. The control of respiration is basically from chemoreceptors in the carotid body and in the arch of the aorta. And both of these receptors respond to the level of oxygen and carbon dioxide. That is what controls respiration. The partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your body. Let me explain it further. Hypercapnia. Hypercapnia means there is a rise in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. When there is a rise in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, it stimulates the areas in the pons and in the medulla to help you breathe. Why can you not hold your breath and kill yourself?
Isn't it because your brain stops it?
And this, when you hold your breath, what happens to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide? Does it increase or decrease?
Increase.
It increases. As the partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases, it stimulates the peripheral receptors in your aortic arch and in your carotid artery to tell the brain, we better breathe. We better breathe. So you can only hold your breath between 2 and 3 minutes. After that, you'll breathe. You cannot kill yourself by holding your breath. It's impossible. It's impossible. Okay? And that's called hypercapnia. I want you to know that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is the most important stimulator of breathing that there is. That is the most important stimulus right here. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide.
Professor?
Yes.
So I thought that it was that you could hold your breath until you passed out, and then when you passed out, that's when you started to breathe again. Is
You
that
are correct. That is
okay?
correct. And this is what we're talking about. This is it. Right. You do pass out, but then you breathe again. You can't kill yourself that way. All
Gotcha.
right. All right. Another stimulus is oxygen. If you don't have enough oxygen, you're going to breathe faster and faster and faster and faster. Okay? But the most important stimulus is right here. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide. That's the number one stimulus to help you breathe. Very important. I don't like this. That's not important. What happens when you age? Your lungs shrink a little bit. Your blood oxygen level drops a little bit. The alveolar cells in your body don't fight off infection as much. You lose cilia in your respiratory cells. So people of my age, and I am elderly, are more susceptible to pneumonia, bronchitis, and emphysema. Okay? So as you age, you are more susceptible to many, many diseases. All right? And these are some of the diseases. I'm going to give you a lecture on lung cancer on Thursday. But these are some of the diseases. You don't have to really know all of them. Not really that important. And some of the PowerPoints, group PowerPoints, will talk about some of these diseases also. All right. Any questions on the respiratory system before we talk about lung volumes? Okay. Let's talk about lung volumes. This is a much better lecture than what your chapter lecture had. Okay. What we're talking about here is the air going in the lungs and the air coming out of the lungs. How do we know your lung has enough capacity to accept the air in and then exhale it all out? This is done as a test. You go into a room and we put a clip on your nose and we put a tube into your mouth and you breathe in and out. Okay, so we eliminate the out of your nose. So all we're doing here now is measuring the amount of air coming in and out of your lungs. We measure 4 volumes and we measure 4 capacities. And the word capacities is a sum of two or more lung volumes. And this is what we measure. And we'll talk about each of these squares individually. We measure tidal volume, TV, the volume of air inspired and expired during a normal, quiet breathing. It's what you're doing right now. And we measure that volume. We measure that volume. So here it is. There's tidal volume. That's what we're measuring. The amount of air going in and out of your lungs during a normal, quiet breathing. Then we measure inspiratory reserve volume, the maximum amount of air that can be inhaled after a normal tidal volume inspiration. What do we say? Take a deep breath. And now we're measuring the inspiratory reserve volume. Here it is. Inspiratory reserve volume. What is the expiratory reserve volume? The expiratory reserve volume is the maximum amount of air that can be exhaled from a resting expiratory level. Blow all your air out, and that measures the ERV, the expiratory reserve volume. The residual volume. The residual volume, or the RV, is the volume of air remaining in the lungs at the end of a maximum respiration. Take a deep breath and blow all your air out. What's left? What's left is the RV. There it is. Now we get into the capacities. We're now taking volumes and adding them together. So what is the VC, the volume, the vital capacity? It is the volume of air that can be exhaled from the lungs at a maximum inspiration. Take a deep breath. Now blow it all out. And that is the vital capacity. The vital capacity is the inspiratory reserve volume, the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume. As you can see, the VC is right there, and it has all of these volumes, the IRV, the TV, and the ERV. The inspiratory capacity, the maximum amount of air that can be inhaled from the end of a tidal volume. Take a deep breath and hold it. The inspiratory capacity is the IRV and the TV. Here is the inspiratory capacity. It is the inspiratory reserve volume and the tidal volume. The FRC, the functional residual capacity, the volume of air remaining in the lungs at the end of a tidal volume expiration. It actually measures the elastic force of the chest wall, exactly balanced by the elastic force of the lungs. The FRC is the ERV and the RV. Here it is. Here is the FRC, and here it is, the expiratory reserve volume and the reserve volume. residual volume. All right. What is the total lung capacities? Well, obviously, it's all the volumes added together. It's the volume of air in the lungs after a maximum inspiration. Take a deep breath and hold it. And now we will measure the TLC, the total lung capacity, the inspiratory reserve, the tidal volume, the expiratory reserve, and the residual volume. Here is the TLC. It consists of 4 volumes. There it is. 4 volumes. All right. Now, that's a much better lecture than the one you got from the other. Let me stop recording.